Man was created in God's own image, and it is precisely for this reason that the killing of an innocent human life is an abomination and a capital offense in the eyes of God.
So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. As horrific and hard to comprehend as it may be, one of the most widespread forms of worship among ancient people involved human sacrifice. Not only in Canaan, but also in northern Africa, India, Europe, and the Americas, the ancients believed that the blood of the sacrifice is what appeased the gods. The pagan practice of blood sacrifice is actually a perversion of the rites given by God to his people, Israel. To his priests he declared, "For the life of the creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul." Sacrifice to any other god was condemned as idolatry. They shall no more offer their sacrifices to demons, after whom they have played the harlot. This shall be a statute forever for them throughout their generations. As we look at the practice of human sacrifice in ancient times, keep in mind that, according to God's perspective, these sacrifices were made to demons, the false gods of the pagan nations. The ancient city of Carthage was the capital of the Phoenician Empire, one of the most advanced civilizations of their time. But recent archaeological expeditions have revealed another notable feature: the incredibly high incidence of child sacrifice. Altars on which children were sacrificed and stone markers, which marked the burial place of their remains, have been uncovered, along with the stone carvings on the markers that depict the children who were sacrificed. Clay jars were used to hold the remains. Burial grounds full of thousands of these ritually sacrificed children have been unearthed. The Carthaginians were descendants of the ancient Canaanites and worshiped the same god, Baal or Moloch. Archaeologists have established that the primary deity that the children were sacrificed to was the goddess Tanit, the name being a regional representation of the more universal Ashtaroth. Written accounts tell us that the priests of Baal would beat drums during the ritual sacrifice in order to drown out the cries of the grieving mothers. As barbaric as all this sounds, we must remember that we are doing much the same thing through abortion, with one obvious exception. Today, we don't commemorate or bury the children we sacrifice.
It would be easy to attribute these ancient sacrificial rites to primitive superstitions and believe that science and intellectual advancement would eventually cause this type of brutality to lessen and finally cease. But archaeologists have also discovered that over Carthage's history, the incidence of child sacrifice, even in the face of considerable intellectual advancement, actually increased until it finally stopped.
And how did it end? When God judged Carthage, Roman armies invaded and destroyed the entire civilization, going so far as to cover the ground with vast amounts of salt so that the land could no longer be cultivated.
It's a marvel that the gospel came in the first century when Roman roads, Roman peace, Roman justice, Roman language had spread throughout the Mediterranean world and paved the way for the gospel. This was already beginning in God's providence with Rome's tenacity in protection of home and horror at the brutality of the pagan nations around them. Now, to be sure, ancient Rome, prior to its acceptance of Christianity, was still brutal. Augustine points this out in The City of God. But it was uniquely prepared in ways that we can't even measure today. By God's good providence, through the war with Carthage, called the Punic Wars. It was a long period of multiple conflicts on sea and land for the control of the Mediterranean. The Carthaginians were the old Phoenicians transplanted to North Africa, and they had a particularly brutal faith that was rooted in the old deities of the Canaanites, brought from the cities of the plain, the Philistines, and ultimately transported to North Africa. As a result, all of the horrors that we read about in the Old Testament, the Asherahs, the Baals, the Molechs, the worship of demons, this was at the heart and soul of Carthaginian culture. When the Romans encountered this, really for the first time in the Punic Wars, they were shocked into the realization of the roots of the old pagan world. They desired to set themselves apart as something different. In fact, it is estimated that 1/2 of all children born in Carthage were ultimately given over to this ritual infanticide slaughter. There were whole sepulchres filled with the bodies of infant children that the Romans discovered when they came and conquered Carthage. It was one of the reasons, and this is rarely discussed by historians, although it's oftentimes listed, it's one of the reasons why the Romans were so brutal in plowing under the city of Carthage and salting the earth. It was their intention that never again would the specter of this kind of awful brutality, this unnatural destruction of your own seed, sweep across the earth again. And interestingly, we note that many of the infanticide walls in Roman military outposts disappeared after the Punic Wars. It so sickened the Romans who actually fought for the liberty of the Republic and ultimately the empire. They were so sickened by what they saw in Carthage that they rid their own practices of the last remnants of infanticide. Hannibal, the great general who crossed the Alps with his famous elephants, was a brilliant general, but he was the bearer of that old, ancient, pagan religion of Baal and Molech. The Romans, not yet Christian, saw the horror of retreating in history and thus fought tooth and nail to hold off Hannibal's brilliant assaults. The result was that Roman culture was left in a kind of no man's land where spiritually they were left to build up the roads, build up the language, the communication, the network that ultimately the gospel would run on and run literally to the ends of the earth just a few generations later.
To this day, the stark ruins of Carthage stand as a testimony that God is not mocked. This should also prompt us to ask ourselves a critically important question. How far are we from facing a similar judgment for our own commitment to rampant child sacrifice?